This video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Sciences, Unit 6, Coaching for Performance and Fitness, and specifies or specifically looks at A3, Best Practice for Coaches. Now, the content of this video requires you to describe, explain and analyse each aspect, so you need to think quite critically, and as hopefully you know already, it will involve defining or describing, explaining through a range of examples, and analysing the impact of each of these topics as having a negative or a positive impact on the coaching dynamic and sessions. So unfortunately, over time there have been incidences where issues have occurred. Former England manager Mark Sampson did make racist comments to one of his players. British gymnastics coach under investigation over athlete abuse claim. And the British Archery Organisation has received 2 formal complaints over incidents that led to a coach's suspension, one being an allegation of a sexual assault involving a young female para-athlete. So all of these examples, and I'm sure there are more sadly, are related to some of the topics in this section, and obviously how a coach should behave and the consequences of, inappropriate practice by coaches. So I've sort of colour coded, this is the specification, and I think they're divided into sort of 4 or 5 sections. Safeguarding and, all associated child protection processes, equal opportunities, training and qualifications, safety, health and safety and emergency procedures, and then administration that coaches might need to complete. So we're going to work through each of those fairly swiftly. So not necessarily a very pleasant topic, but let's start with safeguarding. And really sadly, there are several cases. These are to some degree a bit dated now, but these are, look at this top one. 2016, 350 victims have reported child sexual abuse within UK football clubs, police chiefs have said. Again, this one is related to football. The FA pulled out all major funding for a major review of its child protection 3 years early. Unfortunately, staff have been bullied into not talking and disclosing things that have happened. So, to some extent, there should be real caution and real concern about, coach behaviours, and just hope that things can be put in place to either prevent or certainly educate people to know best practice, to know how to deal with things, and to ensure that anybody employed is going to be an appropriate and effective coach. Hiring and the culture within any organisation are sort of 2 key aspects, I guess, in terms of setting out the parameters of what is acceptable. The hiring process, so if you're advertising for a job as a coach, somebody is, you need a coach, there should be very stringent checks on the coaches that you may employ before you, agree to employ them. But also the culture within a club is critical. If the club allows certain behaviours to go on and to go ahead and to be known, and it's just, nothing's done with it, then you create this acceptability, and obviously that is a fundamentally terrible thing to happen. All coaches have a duty of care. So duty of care means a legal obligation imposed on an individual, requiring that they adhere to a standard of reasonable care while performing any acts that could possibly harm them. So coaches quite clearly are responsible for those that they're coaching, but it goes beyond them, actually. It's the whole environment, it's the club, it's the officials, it's the people that work, the ground staff, it's anybody, it's parents, everybody, officials have a role in ensuring that no harm comes to anybody within reason. So duty of care is a powerful and legal expectation of anybody, especially a coach. There is a lot of legislation associated with looking after, protecting and ensuring that young people can take part in sport and activity without any harm coming to them. Safeguarding has emerged as a phrase, I guess, relatively recently, but is certainly now underpinning all educational, all sporting, all organizational level protection for young people. So it's about, safeguarding is about working together to safeguard children, to protect them from maltreatment, to prevent impairment on their health and their development, to ensure that they grow in circumstances that are safe. You know, this is not just to do with sport, but it very much is to do with sport in the context of what we need to understand. So this is legal requirement to abide by safeguarding. One of the most central ways in which clubs and other organisations which might have sports coaches associated with them can protect young people is to DBS check all staff. There are different levels of DBS, an enhanced or a sort of, I guess, a more standard level. But without doubt, coaches that coach young children or vulnerable adults should be DBS checked. And this basically, again, is a legal requirement of clubs to ensure this is done, to check this is done, as part of any application for employment. And what it essentially does is it checks your background, checks your history, it checks if you've got any records that might put any young people at risk. So a very serious, and some of you guys might have had this done if you are coaches or involved in working with young children. What obviously coaches may need to be mindful of is to look out for any signs of abuse or neglect, and it can be in all sorts of forms. Yes, it can be physical abuse, so there's often rough and tumble with some of the sports we play, there might be bruises and cuts, but if a young person you see maybe appears regularly or on occasions with additional bruising that maybe they're a bit awkward about talking about, or just doesn't add up, that could be a sign that something is astray. Sexual abuse obviously is some of the examples I gave at the start, whether that's inappropriate comments or whether that's physically sort of inappropriateness. Psychological abuse can be any shape or form, basically being mean or obnoxious or bullying or, you know, teasing. It's incredibly powerful, especially if it's ongoing and constant. Neglect is really not being taken care of. Obviously, not everybody has the same wealth, and there may be reasons why somebody, for example, is dressed a certain way or has certain clothing, but if it's to the extent where it might be affecting their health and their safety, then that might be a sign of neglect. And just things to be aware of and try to be, open to recognising and observing. So let's look at what safeguarding actually is. Safeguarding in sport is the process of protecting children and vulnerable adults from harm by providing a safe space in which to play sport and be active. And that's defined by, that quote has come from Sport England. Sport England is the main organisation in England that promotes physical activity for everybody. They want to get everybody being active and healthy. And obviously the prerequisite is that this is done in a safe way. Now, whilst they are the overarching organisation, there are national governing bodies for each sport. So the FA is the football's governing body. The LTA is the Lawn Tennis Association, tennis's governing body. And Sport England has policies on safeguarding, and they insist that the national governing bodies have policies. And the national governing bodies share and insist their expectations and their policies with clubs and lower organisations. So it's kind of like a hierarchy, filtering down the expectations and the needs and the things that must be in place so that young people are safe and able to take part without any risk of harm coming to them. It applies to coaches, whether you're paid, whether you're a volunteer, it could be a parent going along to help. You need to be DBS checked for starters. So it applies to everybody. It's everybody's responsibility to protect young people. Child protection is similar, I guess. It comes under and within the safeguarding principles. Child protection is protecting an individual that has been identified at being at risk of harm or abuse or violence or exploitation or neglect. So if somebody, has been recognised as having issues, maybe at home, maybe some kind of bullying, some kind of psychological harm, then child protections are the things that are put in place to support them and to make sure that they are nurtured as best as possible. So it forms part of the child safeguarding measures. Ultimately, at this point, something's already happened, so it's kind of the last line of defence. Ideally, safeguarding measures are put in place to avoid this sort of level of child protection needing to be done. There is specifically, and I think it's quite sad in a way that we have to have this, a child protection in sport unit. So Sport England collaborated with Childline and the NSPCC to generate a sport-specific unit in order to try and provide for those children who may have already been identified, and to try to support them further and protect them further. But there are some key organisations, obviously, as I've mentioned, the NSPCC, Sport England, DBS, which is a government organisation, the sport-specific subsection of the Child Protection in Sport Unit, and Sports Coach UK. So this is the organisation that often runs and organises and determines the curriculum and the specifications for all the coaching qualifications that you might wish to do. And safeguarding is on all the coaching qualifications. You have to have an understanding of what safeguarding is done and needed, how to do it in order to be a coach. So it's part of the training of being a coach. But also, of course, then these two represent the national governing bodies and their role in ensuring that safeguarding is active and done in sport. Just as an example, Brighton and Hove Albion, this is their website, open to the public, and it has information about what their safeguarding policies are on the website. So you can always have a look, for example, at your club or something like theirs. One of the prerequisites for safeguarding is that every club, sports club, should have a welfare officer, and that's somebody identified in the club with the primary responsibility for managing any concerns about children and for putting in place the safeguarding and ensuring that all staff understand it, know where the policies are, know what to do, know what good practices and bad practices. So there's just a list of some of the responsibilities of the club welfare officer there. I suggest you have a little look at that. So obviously, in terms of analysis, you need to discuss through your sporting examples the impact of good practice or poor practice in terms of safeguarding. I've put in a couple there. There are loads more. Use your own initiative, use your own examples and scenarios to explain those things. Let's move on then to equal opportunities. So a couple of different terms just to be mindful of and to be able to explain. Equality, treating everybody the same and giving everybody the same opportunities and support. So providing the same box to look over the fence. This is the same, everybody's given the same. But what this image on the right actually clearly identifies is you can treat people the same, but they may not still have the same opportunity. This person can see clearly, they can just about see this person still can't do the same, can't have the same opportunity. So equity, which is on the right hand side over here, provides support based on needs, giving everybody what they need to be able to have the same opportunity and the same access. So instead of treating everybody just the same, treat people the way they need to be treated in order to function, operate, perform, enjoy equally. Slightly different there. Inequality, of course, is discrepancy in this, treating people differently, which might be based on your own prejudices. Examples of inequality or equality in sport: pay for professional athletes, for example. The US women's team got rejected in court demanding equal pay. Soccer in the States is huge. The crowds you can see behind, the crowds for women's football is absolutely massive. And yet here we are in Lewis, I think it was a year or two ago, one of the first teams to offer equal salaries to their men's and women's players. I know that to some extent some of the England women's team, it wasn't that long ago, I'm not sure if it is still currently, but they used to have jobs alongside their professional small salary to account for lifestyle and living and existing. And I'm sure that's true of a lot of sports, not just football. Football's obviously a big money sport, but loads and loads of other sports will have inequalities in pay for males and females. The Equality Act 2010, a law that says that nobody is allowed to discriminate against anybody else based on their age, their sexuality, their marital status, whether they're pregnant or not, their race, their religion, their nationality. You can see the list there, their sexual orientation. It should not matter in today's world. Really, it should not matter. But you may be aware this still goes on. Racism in football, still very much present. Gender differences are beginning to change, perhaps, but still in transition. There are lots of issues. Even sexuality, I know there's been a few elite performers in rugby that have come out publicly, but in football, I think, I'm not sure if there's many, but I think there's one, and that's, clearly not how it is. And the reason it's not okay is because people are prejudiced and treat people differently. So you as a coach, being effective, being professional, will treat people with equality and equity. You will not discriminate in any shape or form. You won't talk to your better performers, your more able players, differently to you talk to your less able players because you prefer them. You have to treat everybody equally, regardless of disability. I don't know if you've watched the Paralympics or any events. These performers are competitive, able, elite performers who train hard, who have a different context for their performance, but they are absolutely performers as well. There are a lot of assumptions that can be made about people with disabilities, what they might not be able to do, or what they might not be like with attitude. Actually, they are just sports performers like any other. So let's look at this other, more negative language that you as a coach should not have or not do, but if you do, you will have a very negative impact on experiences for others. And you might be a negative role model if you preach prejudice, if you act with prejudice. You may teach your performers that that's okay and that's what it should be like. So prejudice, prejudge, prejudice. Prejudge someone unfairly, intolerantly, or dislike them purely based on aspects of them, their race, religion, sexuality, gender, age, disability. So you have decided beforehand what you think about somebody without knowing them, just based on aspects of who they are. Stereotypes is, prejudice is often based on stereotypes. So you might assume, based on somebody's sexual orientation, a male is going to be a ballet dancer, a female is going to be a footballer or good at football. Or somebody who's good at football who's female is going to be gay. So this stereotyping or prejudice is very negative, it's very damaging and completely inappropriate as the role of a coach. You need to treat people equally regardless of who they are. I'm not going to go through these. This is just sort of prompt questions for you to have a think about. So make sure you know what different kinds of inequality there are, what reasons why somebody treat people unequally. Does it vary between sport? Are they more prevalent in certain sports than others? What can a coach do to promote equal opportunities? And how should a coach respond if, or deal with, any incident? Let's say one of the players talks to one of their teammates in a really disrespectful way based on whether it's their race or their sexuality or whatever, age. How do you deal with it as a coach? Think of some examples, analyse those examples, those different sporting contexts in your assessment to show distinction level analysis. Possible factors that might affect, so the potential equal opportunities factors, coach ignorance and lack of awareness, education matters, training matters, facilities, whether people can or can't afford transport. You shouldn't be biased or discriminate based on somebody's wealth. Safety, inadequacy, fees, can they afford the membership fees? Are there any concessions? Can they afford the kit? Can you do anything to support some performers and equipment? Maybe people don't have the same amount of time to commit to your sport because they have other responsibilities. Can you give them equal opportunity to work around such things? And of course, their own personal experiences. Some people may have negative attitudes or stereotypes based on maybe being bullied themselves. Again, positive impacts of demonstrating and promoting equal opportunities. Think of a few. Negative impacts and the consequences of a coach demonstrating or having poor equal opportunity approach. Think of a few of your own. So moving on, CPD and qualifications. So again, some prompt questions for you to have a look at. You can pause the video and take those in yourself. But basically, coaches ideally are qualified and continually developing their knowledge and their understanding and their ability to coach. Now, the ability to do that may be down to the individual coach if they're sort of self-employed, but also clubs should really be investing and either contributing to or paying for the coaching qualifications. They can be done online to some degree. Often they're person to person, so they might be weekends. That's a bit of a commitment for coaches, so especially if they're working. So it could be a big ask, but ideally coaches are constantly being responsible for seeking to develop themselves and their own understanding. Now, some of the qualifications could be academic, so more and more there are coaching related level 2, which is GCSE level 3, which is BTEC A level. So there are specific BTEC courses which are coaching focused, or higher levels which are kind of like nearly degree level in between. Or university degrees, there are very much coaching specific, sports coaching specific degrees, and you can go on to do masters and PhD in research, that sort of field. So it can be academic. Of course, many coaches have the more sports organisation based ones, your level 1, 2, 3 coaching, your refereeing badges, other specialist organisational qualifications, additional stuff like nutrition or personal training or gym instructors. You know, there are other things that you can do to prepare yourself, to inform yourself, to educate yourself, and that should be promoted for all coaches. It might be a really good thing to include in your work, maybe your own sport. Do some research into your own sport. What coaching courses could you do progressively? The easier ones, the more elite ones, how much are they? That could be a limitation that you could discuss. How long does it take? What are the requirements? What contents do the courses cover? Of course, what you're going to do is discuss the impact of coaches with qualifications, with ongoing training, and then you're going to identify several negative impacts if coaches aren't qualified, or the negative impact of them just being stale and not updating their knowledge. Here are a few more you can have a little look at and pick out some to perhaps use. So there are 2 more little topics to hit in this video. First one being health and safety in coaching. You can see if you pause and have a look at this image, so much can go wrong fairly easily. But it is the coach's responsibility, legal responsibility, to put as much in place as possible to prevent any harm coming to participants or themselves. That might primarily be through things like risk assessments. So again, some questions for you to pause the video and have a look at, and you need to understand these things. What is a risk assessment? It's something that's done prior to coaching sessions and should be constantly updated and adjusted as is required, as is necessary. Primarily what you do to start off with is you kind of become the cynic. You think, right, what could go wrong in this session? What are the hazards? What are the possible things that might cause harm? You figure out who might be at harm and how, and then you try to think through, well, is this likely to harm them? What can I do to either reduce or remove that risk? And I put control measures in place. And you do all you can. Those control measures are things, whether it's restricting where somebody performs, whether it's making sure that they warm up properly, whether it's making sure they wear the safety equipment they're supposed to be wearing. Those are control measures. And it could be that if those control measures are sufficient, that the session is absolutely safe and not a problem. So what could go wrong? What could cause harm? Who would it affect? Who would it harm? What can I do about it? And is there enough control to allow the session to go ahead? Or if the risk is too great, even with some things in place, it's still too risky, you would need to reevaluate whether the session happened, and probably it wouldn't happen. All of this needs to be recorded and implemented on the day. So it's all very well saying you're going to do a warm-up at the start of your session. If you don't do a warm-up and somebody hurts themselves and the parents say, well, they didn't do a warm-up, you are negligent, you are at risk. So it's absolutely important that all this is documented and done and reviewed. So once a risk assessment is done, that's not the end of it. It's a working document. It needs to be revisited regularly. At BTEC, we revisit them certainly every year and check that they still apply. But if anything was to happen, we would revisit it and adjust it if needed, if that needed to happen. This is a sort of way of determining the amount of risk, the chance that somebody is going to be hurt. So when you're completing a risk assessment, you have to give a rating out of 5 to say how likely is this hazard going to be a problem. So what is the chance that it will cause a problem? 1 to 5. 1 being not very much, 5 being highly likely. You also need to give a 1 to 5 rating on how severe the consequences would be if this hazard did happen. So if somebody experienced that problem, would they be severely life-threateningly injured, or would it be fairly minimal? And what you can see hopefully from the colour coding here is that depending on you times one by the other basically, and whatever the answer is, that's the risk rating. Green risk ratings, you'd probably go ahead, the risk quite low, it's probably okay. Yellow risk ratings, medium risk, this should only be tolerated in the short term. You might need to think about doing something else to try and reduce that risk. That's going into dodgy territory. If there's a risk rating, basically you don't go ahead until you can figure out a way of reducing the risk and the chance of something harming somebody. So that's the risk rating matrix that we use at BTEC. Here's an example of a risk assessment. You can pause the video and have a look at that. Hazards, who will it harm, what's in place to try and reduce it, the 2 numbers and the risk rating, and then any action that might be necessary. And here's a blank version. You could pop one in from one of your own coaching sessions, so fill it in yourself. So just to summarise, this is risk assessment process. Go through the process, what hazards might there be, who might be harmed, can you do things and put control measures in the way to eliminate it, and recheck and update as you go. Also as a coach, you need to be mindful of emergency procedures. Now you might be playing on your own training area, you might know where the emergency rendezvous area is, you might know what the alarm sounds like and what to do in that action, but you might be at an away fixture and need to know how to deal with emergencies. Here's some example of emergency procedures or things you might need to know. You should probably have experience, if it's at a club, a sports club, you should have done some fire drills so that anybody, participants, your team, know what to do if an alarm is raised, where to go, what evacuation procedures, what route should be taken, where are the nearest phones. You might have your mobile on you. If not, where do you go to make a call to seek emergency support? What first aid procedures are there? Are there people who are trained? Who are they? Where's the first aid equipment? Obviously, pre-session check for safety of equipment. Risk assessment will be in place and thought through anyway. Have you got a register of all your participants? Have you got their emergency contacts? So there's all sorts of things that could generate an emergency. Somebody could be quite severely injured, not necessarily at your fault, in one of your sessions. What do you do? And all of these procedures should be thought through and known prior to sessions. Obviously mentioned first aid. It matters how many first aiders there are. It's really a necessity really that coaches are qualified, or some are coaches qualified as a first aider. And also, who is responsible for checking that the first aid equipment is up to date and in date and a complete kit? What a disaster it would be if your club used a first aid kit, stuff was used, didn't get replaced, and off you go on a match. Somebody gets hurt and you haven't got what you should have in there. That is negligence and not going to do well in terms of your own responsibility, but also your club. It's helpful if coaches have a little bit of insight into typical injuries associated with your sport, the sorts of things that can often occur, and therefore you can perhaps do training and strengthening, prepare your athletes through the sessions to try to reduce the chances of them having injuries, but it's certainly something to be mindful of. Again, once you're explaining all of these things relating to health and safety, you need to identify and discuss how having it all in place will have a positive impact, and specifically the sorts of reasons why, and of course why not having appropriate health and safety principles in place can be problematic and very seriously have a negative impact. So the sorts of documents this might mean is something called a PARQ, a Physical Activity Readiness Questionnaire. So sometimes, this might not happen every session, of course. It could be you meet new players and they join your club or your team. You want to kind of know a bit about their physical status. You want to know if they have any existing medical conditions, and that it's appropriate for them to join in and take part in your activity. If there's any reason why they're not, you really mustn't allow them to. It would be negligent of you to do that. So filling in almost like a health screening questionnaire could be an important administrative document. Informed consent. So especially if your participants are young, but in any case, what you need is your participants, your players, to understand what you're going to do in sessions and then give consent to take part. I mean, this particular example is for a strength test. So if you did a really intense test, like a bleep test with your players, you need them to understand that it's going to feel unpleasant, it's exhaustive, and they then consent to do that. If your players are young, this should be parental consent, not just the young person as well. Things like an attendance register. You must track who is at your session that week, that session next week. It's important that if there was an emergency, you know who should be present, and therefore if somebody is missing. That's an obvious one. Things like risk assessments we've already talked about. If anything happens, you should complete an accident report form. So college has accident report forms. Should any kind of accident or incident happen within a session, we have to complete it, say who is involved, what was done, why, what sort of situation it happened in, any first aid that was administered, and the contact details of the coach or the players as well. Just in case anything happens more seriously, we need to know the circumstances was. So it's really important that things are reported, even if they're not needed, that they're reported at that time. Insurance documents. So coaches must be insured for lots of reasons. If there is an accident that happens and parents or a player wishes to challenge it and feels that there was negligent behaviour, you will need insurance to pay for any payments that maybe have to go to these people if you are found to be negligent. Insurance could be also for your equipment. If you've spent a lot of money on equipment and let's say somebody pinches it, then it might be you seek to have the insurance cover the cost of that, because some of the equipment is incredibly expensive. Then we go down to administrative documents like planning sessions and the documentation. What are you doing in your series of sessions? This one session today, have you got your session plan? And it could be that there's an annual plan. It might be a document where I've talked in previous videos about macrocycles, microcycles, mesocycles, the phases, and your documents might account for what you're trying to achieve and your planning aspirations and targets for each of those. Lastly then, you will of course discuss the positive and negative impact of having good administrative document and being organised and having everything up to date, both legally and practically.